Your chest tightens into a cold, hard knot right under your ribs at dusk. The exact moment you hear the heavy locks click shut in the freezing rain. This heaviness has been growing for months. A slow-burning ache in your marrow every time your own son looks right through you. You've felt your life's foundation cracking for years, but nothing you did stopped this betrayal. You tried staying quiet and giving more, yet the storm still came. This crushing pressure isn't your defeat. It's an alarm revealing your enemy just walked into a trap. In the next few minutes, you'll understand why Julian just signed a legal death warrant he doesn't even know exists. My name is Arthur Sterling, a 67-year-old engineer who spent 40 years designing the massive foundations of this city's skyline. I believed in logic and the permanence of steel, but my own foundation crumbled 14 months ago when my beloved Eleanor passed away. She was a concert pianist whose music breathed life into our mansion, and I still smell her faint lavender perfume whenever I pass her silent Steinway. My deepest regret is that I was far too stern with our son Julian during his childhood. I built the foundations of this city, but I clearly failed to build a shred of character in my own flesh and blood, a mistake I realized far too late. My life settled into a quiet rhythm involving my son, Julian, and his manipulative wife, Camille. Every morning I tended to the delicate petals in Eleanor's rose garden, and every afternoon I reread the weathered letters we exchanged during my long engineering trips abroad. Before we continue this account of betrayal, I want to thank you all for being here. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. This story is a dramatized version of real family events, with names and details altered to protect the identities of those involved. I never suspected Julian and Camille were already calculating the market value of my grief and planning my permanent erasure from this house. 2 days before the final eviction notice arrived, I stood in the doorway of Eleanor's former sunroom, now Camille's makeshift office. My eyes snagged on a small, rusted engineer's compass, sitting atop a pile of glossy blueprints for their planned renovations. It was nestled in its original velvet-lined box, a precision tool I had used to design foundations of Central Plaza in 1985. I knew with absolute engineering certainty that this specific box was supposed to be empty. Eleanor and I had joked about losing that instrument years ago during a move. Seeing it now, serving as a trivial paperweight for my home's destruction, felt like a structural defect in reality itself. I tried telling myself it was a coincidence, a forgotten relic unearthed by movers, yet the math simply did not add up. Later that evening, while retrieving my last few letters from the piano stool, I noticed a fresh scuff mark on the hidden underside of the lid, exactly where Eleanor once hid her most private journals. The scuff was deep, revealing raw wood that had not been exposed to air in decades, suggesting someone had recently forced a compartment I did not even know existed. Why was a ghost's compass reappearing while her secret hiding spots were being ransacked? A cold, nameless suspicion solidified in my chest, a structural crack I could no longer ignore. I checked into a cramped room at the Greystone Inn on 4th Street, a place that smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. My hands, still calloused from decades of handling steel girders, shook as I opened my laptop to access the Sterling Foundation's archives. I had to be a ghost in my own system, moving through the digital blueprints of my life with the same caution I used when surveying a faulty skyscraper base. I wasn't just a father looking for an apology anymore. I was a structural engineer looking for the specific point of failure. Every click felt like a betrayal of the son I had raised, but the math in my head refused to balance. The first anomaly hit me like a falling brick on a construction site. On April 12, 2025, exactly 3 weeks before Eleanor's stroke, a sum of $450,000 was transferred from our primary trust to an account labeled Project Phoenix. I cross-referenced the transaction ID 8829X and realized the authorization hadn't come from my terminal or Eleanor's piano room tablet. It had been executed using an administrative override code I only gave Julian for emergencies during my 2023 bypass surgery. My son hadn't waited for his mother to pass away to start carving up her legacy. He had been reaching into our pockets while we were still breathing. I spent the next 6 hours in that dim hotel room, documenting every timestamp and IP address associated with Project Phoenix. The patterns were chillingly surgical, showing a series of small $5,000 withdrawals designed to stay beneath the bank's automated fraud detection thresholds. By the time I reached the bottom of the spreadsheet, the total exceeded $2 million, all diverted into a shell company registered in Delaware. My chest tightened with a cold, professional fury that overrode my paternal grief. I had built foundations that lasted half a century, yet I had allowed a termite to hollow out my own home from the inside while I was distracted by flowers. I knew I couldn't navigate this legal minefield alone, so I reached out to Marcus Thorne, the only man I still trusted. Marcus had been our family's estate lawyer for over 30 years and was more of an honorary brother than a legal consultant. We met at the Iron Grate, a quiet diner where we'd celebrated every major Sterling Foundations contract since 1995. When he sat down, his face was a mask of weary indignation, his eyes reflecting the same disappointment I felt in my marrow. He didn't offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy. He simply laid a heavy, weathered leather briefcase on the table between us and sighed. Marcus opened the briefcase and slid a manila folder toward me, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He explained that the first will Julian had used to evict me was actually an unsigned draft Eleanor had created as a psychological test for our son. She had called it a honeypot, a document designed to see if Julian would choose greed over his father's well-being if he thought the opportunity was ripe. Marcus revealed that Eleanor had specifically instructed him to withhold the legitimate final will until Julian's true character was revealed through his actions. The current legal standing of my eviction was built on a foundation of absolute sand and calculated deception. We spent an hour comparing the signatures on Julian's filing with the authentic documents in Marcus's private vault. The forgery was sophisticated, likely created using a high-resolution scan of my old engineering seals from the 1990s, but the ink density was wrong. Marcus pointed out that the digital timestamp on the metadata of the filed document was June 14, 2025, 2 days after the funeral. This wasn't just a misunderstanding of Eleanor's wishes. It was a criminal act of fraud executed with the cold precision of a predator. My own son had sat at the funeral lunch, weeping into his silk handkerchief, while his digital signature was stealing my life. As Marcus dug deeper, a second, more sinister layer of the conspiracy began to emerge from the legal shadows. Camille wasn't just a manipulative bystander. She was the primary architect of the offshore diversions and the shell company's incorporation. We found emails from November 2024 showing her communicating with a high-risk investment firm in Dubai, promising them the Sterling mansion as collateral for a private equity loan. The scale of the betrayal expanded from a simple family spat to a multi-million-dollar international fraud scheme involving people I had never even met. Julian wasn't just greedy. He was a pawn in a game Camille was playing with our entire history. The investigation turned from financial to deeply personal when Marcus produced a document that made my blood turn to ice. It was a draft for a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent, supported by a falsified psychiatric report from a certain Dr. Eris Thorne. This doctor had no relation to Marcus, but the name choice was a deliberate, cruel mockery designed to confuse me during a potential trial. They weren't just planning to take the money and the house. They were preparing to lock me away in a state-run facility to ensure I could never challenge their theft. The risk was no longer just about property. It was about my very freedom. I felt the walls of the diner closing in as the full weight of their malice settled onto my shoulders. Marcus reached into his briefcase one last time and pulled out a thick blue envelope that Eleanor had left in his private safe, marked only for my eyes. He told me that Julian thinks he has already won the kingdom, but he has no idea that this single envelope contains the document that will end his life as he knows it. Before I open this blue envelope and change everything forever, I need to ask you something. Should I take everything back and leave Julian with nothing, or should I show him mercy? Type A for everything, or B for mercy. I sat in the dim light of Marcus's office on June 18, 2025, staring at the digital paper trail that dismantled my son's lies. The Project Phoenix spreadsheet was just the beginning. There was a ledger of secret transactions involving a construction firm I'd competed with for decades. My son hadn't just stolen our retirement. He had sold the blueprints of Sterling Foundations to our rivals, the Henderson Group, for a fraction of their worth. Each signature on those digital contracts was a jagged blade cutting through my chest, dated as far back as November 2024. Seeing my own family name sold off like scrap metal by my only child made my engineering heart stutter in disbelief and cold fury. The treachery wasn't limited to Julian and Camille. It was a systemic infection involving people I had trusted for years within the company. I found encrypted emails between Camille and my former head of logistics, Robert Vance, discussing the liquidation of the primary asset, which meant my life's work. They weren't just taking the cash, they were dismantling the company's infrastructure, selling off equipment at a loss to offshore buyers in Panama. Every time Robert smiled at me during my recovery, he was actually coordinating with Camille to ensure the foundations I built were hollowed out from beneath my feet. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was an organized, multi-layered criminal syndicate operating under my own roof. Marcus then pointed out a catastrophic financial detail that explained Julian's desperate pace in evicting me from the estate. My son had already taken out a $5 million private equity loan from an offshore bank in Dubai, using the mansion as collateral. He had been pre-spending the inheritance on a fleet of luxury vehicles and high-risk tech investments that had all recently collapsed into worthlessness. If Julian didn't sell the house and liquidate the trust by August 15th, the Dubai lenders would likely seize everything, including the Sterling name. The weight of his staggering debt meant he wasn't just greedy. He was a cornered animal willing to destroy his own father to avoid a total financial execution. As we dug deeper, a chilling realization settled over me. I was being watched. Marcus showed me a security log from my own smart home system that had been surreptitiously installed by Camille's security consultant last month. They were tracking my GPS coordinates through my phone and had even installed hidden microphones in the roses of Eleanor's garden. Every conversation I'd had with her ghost, every moment of my private morning, had been recorded and analyzed by a pair of predators looking for any sign of mental decline. The realization that my most intimate moments of grief were being used as tactical data for my own destruction made my skin crawl with a cold, visceral sense of violation. The pressure of playing the victim while holding the keys to their destruction became an agonizing physical weight behind my eyes. I had to return to the Greystone Inn, knowing that every move I made was likely being reported back to the mansion. Camille's influence was like a slow-acting poison, convincing Julian that my very existence was an obstacle to the visionary life they deserved to lead. I remembered the way she used to adjust my tie with a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes. Now I understood that those smiles were just a way to check my pulse and see how much longer I would last before I finally gave up. The risk shifted from financial to terrifyingly personal when Marcus uncovered a draft for a legal petition to have me involuntarily committed. They had bribed a certain Dr. Eris Thorne, a name chosen to mock my lawyer, to sign off on a psychiatric evaluation claiming I suffered from late-stage dementia. The report detailed fabricated instances of me wandering the streets and talking to walls, all supported by edited audio from their hidden microphones. If they succeeded, I wouldn't just lose my house. I would lose my autonomy, locked away in a high-security facility where my protests would only serve as proof of my supposed insanity. My own son was preparing a cage for me to rot in silently. On the evening of June 20th, A black sedan with tinted windows followed me for 3 miles as I walked back from the diner. The driver didn't try to hide, lingering at the edge of the streetlights like a silent threat from Julian's new business associates. I felt the sharp, stinging adrenaline of a man who knows he is being hunted in the very city he helped build. My hands, once used to drafting the safety protocols for skyscrapers, now gripped a heavy iron wrench I'd kept in my coat pocket for protection. The world I once understood through blueprints and logic was now a dark maze where my own flesh and blood was the primary architect of my demise. I finally opened the thick blue envelope Eleanor had left for me, and the contents were more devastating than any legal document I'd ever seen. It contained a USB drive with hidden video recordings from the sunroom, showing Julian and Camille laughing while they practiced forging my signature on the first will. But the real blow was a recorded conversation from the night Eleanor died, where Camille suggested that withholding the medication would simply be a mercy for everyone involved. I stared at the screen as the foundation of my memory of that night crumbled into dust. They hadn't just waited for her to die. They had actively ensured that she would never wake up to stop them. The truth of what happened that night in the sunroom is far more disturbing than a simple case of inheritance fraud or a family eviction. I am holding the evidence that could send my own son to a maximum security prison for the rest of his miserable life. But doing so means reliving the most painful moment of my existence. What I am about to show you next is extremely graphic and deeply upsetting, revealing the true face of the monsters I once called family. If you have a sensitive heart or cannot handle the reality of ultimate betrayal, I suggest you stop watching now. For those who stay, prepare yourselves, because the next revelation will change everything you thought you knew. The blue envelope wasn't just paper. It held a digital confession from Eleanor recorded weeks before her stroke. My hands went numb as the video played, showing Eleanor at her piano, her voice steady despite the illness she felt coming. She revealed that the first will Julian used to evict me was a deliberate forgery she had planted as a final test of our son's integrity. She had documented Julian and Camille's illegal attempts to bypass the trust, creating a legal poison pill that activated the moment Julian filed the forged document. The realization that my wife had been fighting a silent war from her deathbed to protect me made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. The air in the Greystone Inn felt suddenly thin, my lungs struggling to process the staggering scale of Eleanor's tactical foresight. Marcus explained that the $40 million estate Julian thought he had seized was tied to a restrictive life insurance policy that only pays out if I remain the sole occupant of the Sterling mansion. By evicting me and filing the forgery, Julian hadn't just secured the money. He had effectively voided the entire policy, leaving the estate's liquidity at zero. Even worse, the $5 million loan he'd taken from the Dubai lenders was now personally guaranteed by him, not the trust. My son hadn't just lost his inheritance, he had signed his own financial death warrant while laughing in my face. My mind raced back to Julian's 21st birthday, a memory that now felt like a structural failure in my own perception. I remembered handing him the keys to a custom Ferrari, my heart swelling with pride at being able to provide what I never had. I saw him now, not thanking me, but immediately checking the dashboard to ensure it was the latest model, his eyes already searching for the next upgrade. I realized that every time I had been stern with him, I wasn't being too hard. I was seeing the cracks in his foundation that I was too afraid to acknowledge. The boy I used to hold was gone, replaced by a predator who had actively accelerated his mother's end for a phantom fortune. I closed the laptop, a cold engineering clarity settling over my soul as the blue light reflected off the tears I refused to let fall. There was no room left for paternal mercy, or the ghost of a love that Julian had systematically dismantled with his greed. I reached for the heavy iron wrench in my coat pocket, feeling its solid weight, a tool for rebuilding that would now serve as an instrument of total justice. Tomorrow, Julian would learn that you never attempt to demolish a structure until you understand the strength of its foundation. Before I walk back into that mansion and reclaim my life, I need to know one thing. Are you still here? Type, "I am here," in the comments right now. I walked into the mansion at exactly 8:15 p.m. on June 22, 2025, the heavy oak doors swinging open to reveal a sea of expensive suits. Julian was standing in the foyer, a glass of vintage scotch in one hand, celebrating the death of my legacy with the city's social elite. Beside me, Detective Miller and Marcus Thorne stood like statues of judgment, their presence a cold draft in the room. The music died instantly as the guests noticed the disheveled man in the rain-soaked coat standing beside the law. I didn't say a word. I simply raised the blue envelope, its presence cutting through the opulence like a structural flaw finally ready to collapse the building. Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed against the marble floors, stepping forward to sneer directly into my face. "Back for your belongings, old man? I told you the state-run facility is expecting you," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the guests to maintain his charade of authority. He reached to grab the envelope, but Detective Miller stepped forward, placing a firm, gloved hand on Julian's chest. Marcus unfolded the legitimate second will, reading the cruelty clause aloud with a voice like a funeral bell. The room went silent as the guests realized the $40 million they were celebrating was a legal trap that had just been sprung on their host. Camille tried to intervene, her voice a shrill melody of manipulation, as she clutched Julian's arm and pointed a trembling finger at me. "He's senile. This is a confused man being used by a greedy lawyer," she cried out, scanning the room for support from her socialite friends. She looked at Detective Miller, trying to use her charm to dismiss the evidence, but the officer simply produced the warrant for her arrest. The facade of the perfect power couple was cracking, the gold paint peeling away to reveal the rusted ambition underneath. They were no longer victors of a family war. They were suspects in an international fraud investigation being exposed publicly. The final breaking point came when Marcus played the audio recording of Camille suggesting they withhold Eleanor's medication to accelerate the inheritance. Julian's face turned a violent shade of crimson, and he exploded, screaming so loudly the crystal chandeliers seemed to vibrate. "I deserve that money. I spent my whole life being your shadow, following your logic while you loved buildings more than your own son," he shrieked, his confession echoing through the hall and into the recording phones of the guests. He admitted to the forgery, the offshore accounts, and the total betrayal, his words acting as a signed confession that no lawyer in the world could ever undo. Detective Miller didn't hesitate, spinning Julian around and clicking the cold steel handcuffs onto his wrists in front of every prominent figure in the city. "Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for grand larceny, forgery, and elder abuse," the officer stated, his voice booming with the weight of absolute authority. Camille was led away in tears, her designer dress snagging on the furniture she had tried to steal from my wife's memory. The guests watched in stunned silence, their phones capturing the total downfall of the man who had invited them to witness his triumph. The public exposure was surgical, stripping away their dignity before they even reached the police cruiser. The legal victory was absolute, with the judge later sentencing Julian to 12 years in a federal penitentiary and ordering the immediate return of the entire trust. Julian was found personally liable for the $5 million debt to the Dubai lenders, a financial execution ensuring he would never own so much as a watch again. Marcus confirmed that every cent of the $40 million estate was back under my control, safe within the foundations Eleanor and I built. As the last police car pulled away, I stood in the silence of the garden, the evening air smelling of crushed roses and rain. The justice was final, the defeat irreversible, and the Sterling name was cleansed. 8 months have passed since the cold rain washed away Julian's greed, and the mansion finally feels like a sanctuary again. I spent the spring months restoring Eleanor's rose garden, specifically the rare lavender hybrids she loved so dearly. Every morning, I sit on the same piano bench Julian once tossed into the mud, and I listen to a silence now filled with peace instead of tension. I have established a new foundation to help elderly professionals whose legacies were nearly erased by younger, colder hands. Touching the polished Steinway today, I finally whispered to Eleanor that our foundations are level and secure at last, closing the wound that nearly destroyed my very soul. They say money is the root of all evil, but I believe money is simply a mirror that reveals your true soul when you think no one is watching. I failed as a father by focusing on the steel of my buildings while ignoring the cracks in my son's character, a mistake I will carry forever. You must remember that a life without a solid spiritual foundation is just a house of cards waiting for the inevitable storm. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to join our community. Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. This was a dramatized account of real events. Names and locations were changed for privacy. God bless you.